At 1:48 a.m. on March 3, 2020, a violent EF4 tornado touched down near Baxter, Tennessee, and in 8 minutes would claim 19 lives.
Incredible staccato lightning barrage here. Now that I'm filming, it's going to wrap up, I'm sure, but bang, 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 lightning bolts. There's one. Boom.
The phones screamed first. Not the old-fashioned ring of an alarm clock, not the gentle chime of a morning notification. The sound that pierced through the darkness of Hensley Drive at 1:57 a.m. on March 3, 2020, was the urgent, insistent wail of wireless emergency alerts, dozens of them, all at once, vibrating on nightstands, shrieking from charging cables, demanding attention. But for most people on this quiet cul-de-sac in Cookeville, Tennessee, the warnings came too late.
Walk up here and you know that there were families.
Kimberly Frick-Welker lives down the road, her neighbors spending hours finding what does look familiar.
6 homes were right here on this cul-de-sac.
Her home was one of a few spared in the EF4 tornado. Now she's battling anguish others in her position feel.
You walk up here and you know there were families in these homes and they've lost everything, and then you go back to your home and you don't have power or water, and that just seems so insignificant.
She says survivor's guilt is a real thing. It's a real burden too.
Just this wide range of emotion, from feeling fortunate to feeling very, very guilty that your home wasn't harmed.
Every step she takes, she's reminded of what could have been.
He could feel his house lift and move forward. And
like her neighbor, David Gorchop.
Josh Kimberlin's eyes snapped open. The sound he'd heard it before, in the daytime, during routine tornado warnings that came and went like summer thunderstorms. But this was different. The phone's alarm blared from the nightstand. Beside him, Aaron stirred. Down the hall, in the small bedroom decorated with dinosaurs and toy trucks, 2-year-old Sawyer slept. They had maybe 60 seconds. The house began to shake. Not the gentle rumble of thunder. This was something else, a vibration that started in the foundation and climbed through the walls. The windows rattled in their frames. Outside, the darkness seemed to deepen, to solidify into something physical. Josh reached for Aaron. The roar came next, not like a freight train, though that's what everyone always says. More like the earth itself had opened up, like the sky was tearing apart at the seams.
so you felt the house shaking, but you didn't realize you were literally...
Yeah, I didn't realize I was flying through the air. No.
He was hiding in his bathroom with his dog when the tornado pulled his home from the foundation and moved it 60 feet to the road.
The whole house was shaking and moving. I didn't realize it threw the entire house until I made it out of it.
Who knows what could have happened if not for the 2 large trees that stopped the house from its trajectory.
The wind hit 175 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. The Kimberlin home, 2,000 square feet of brick and wood, built to Tennessee building codes, anchored to its foundation with steel bolts, simply ceased to exist. The walls didn't collapse, they exploded. The roof didn't lift off. It disintegrated. Every nail, every board, every piece of glass became a missile launched into the darkness at speeds that would tear through human flesh like paper. In 8 minutes, the tornado would carve a path 8.2 to 3 miles long through Putnam County. It would destroy 170 homes. It would kill 19 people. 5 of them would be children. But right now, in this moment, on Hensley Drive, there is only the wind and the dark and the impossible violence of air moving faster than any building was designed to withstand.
It's just where I hunkered down.
As they all try to move forward, coping with the weight of emotions, guilt or not, needs the familiarity of community.
All of us need to reach out and have someone help us process.
3/4 of a mile west, Charles Williams was dragging his family into the only room that might save them. Get in the bathroom, now. He'd been an Army veteran. He'd served in combat zones. He knew what mortal danger sounded like, and when he'd woken to the sound, he'd reacted on instinct. Grab the kids. Get to the interior room. Get low. The bathroom was small, windowless, reinforced by plumbing stacks. It was the best they had. The tornado was 20 seconds away. Tamara pressed herself into the corner with their daughter. Charles threw himself over them both, the youngest child wedged between them. The walls around them, the bedroom, the living room, the kitchen, were about to become memories. "Close your eyes," Charles said. "Don't look." The house began to scream.
Officers checking through debris and making sure everyone was okay. Just moments after the tornado touched down, you can see that they pulled a woman from debris. An EF3 tornado hit that area Tuesday.
200 yards to the north, Amy Jennings stood at her bedroom window. She shouldn't have been awake, shouldn't have been watching, but something, some instinct, some subconscious recognition of danger had pulled her from sleep. Now she stood in the darkness, looking out at the neighborhood, and watched physics make a liar of probability. She saw it happen. Saw the house on Plunk-Whitson Road, a solid brick structure, lights still on inside, simply lift off its foundation. Not explode, not collapse, lift, like a toy in the hands of an angry child. The roof peeled away first, tumbling into the void. Then the walls followed, one by one, until there was nothing left but a concrete slab and the glow of exposed electrical wires. Another house beside it lost only its second story. The tornado took the roof, the attic, the master bedroom, everything above the first floor, and left the rest intact. The family car sat undamaged in the driveway. "Daryl," Amy whispered. "Daryl, wake up."
Every house down here is tore apart.
Okay, ma'am, we've got help on the way down there, okay?
Okay.
Is it just your parents that are in the house?
Thank you. Yes, and my little
Okay.
sister, my other little sister are trapped too.
Okay, so there are 4 people trapped in that house?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you were just listening to 911 calls made in Putnam County moments after an EF4 tornado hit that area on Tuesday.
12,000 feet above the destruction, the supercell thunderstorm that spawned this violence was performing a trick that meteorologists would spend weeks trying to explain. The storm was cycling. It had been on the ground for over an hour already. First, as the Nashville tornado, an EF3 that had torn through the state capital, ripping apart Germantown, destroying John C. Tune Airport, killing 5 people over a 60-mile track. But then, approaching Putnam County, the tornado had lifted, dissipated. The radar signature weakened. To anyone monitoring the storm, it looked like the supercell was dying. It wasn't dying. It was reloading. Inside the rotating updraft, the rear flank downdraft, a river of cold air descending from the storm's core, was wrapping around the old circulation, choking it off. But simultaneously, a new area of rotation was forming, tightening, organizing itself. The mesocyclone was shedding its old tornado like a snake shedding skin, preparing to drill a new vortex to the ground. This one would be stronger.
I was over here and I was constantly looking back this way, like, looking for him.
I can go out and get a welder, but it won't be Todd. You can't replace Todd.
Well, Todd and Sue had been together, we're told, for almost 10 years.
The meteorologist saw it on radar exactly 1 minute after it happened, at 2:02 a.m. The Doppler velocity scan showed what forecasters call a violent couplet, a tight signature of winds moving toward and away from the radar at incredible speeds, separated by less than a mile. The rotation was intense. The gate-to-gate velocities exceeded 80 knots. The debris ball, the radar signature of objects being lofted into the air, was brilliant, unmistakable. The tornado warning for Putnam County had been issued at 1:48 a.m., but the tornado itself had touched down at 1:48 a.m. Lead time, 0 minutes. For the residents of Hensley Drive, Double Springs, and Echo Valley, the difference between warning and impact was measured in heartbeats, not minutes. They went from sleep to survival mode with no time to process, no time to move, no time to seek shelter more substantial than an interior closet or bathroom. The ones who made it would spend the rest of their lives asking themselves what they did right. The ones who didn't never had the chance to ask.
Homes were gone.
I would describe it like you might see a war zone in a movie.
Lauren Farmer is one of many who survived this deadly tornado. Other families mourned the loss of their loved ones as 19 died in Putnam County.
When the wind stopped, Brian Selby was still alive. His house damaged, but standing sat at the edge of the path. When the roar had started, he'd done what his parents had always taught him. Get low, get to the center of the house, cover your head. He'd survived. But as he stumbled to his feet in the darkness, feeling the rain on his face, hearing the strange silence that follows catastrophe, his first thought was for his parents. Keith and Kathy Selby lived in a mobile home less than 500 yards away. Brian grabbed a flashlight. The power was out across the entire area. The only light came from lightning. The storm was still overhead, still producing rain and thunder, though the tornado itself had moved on. He ran. The landscape was unrecognizable. Trees were down everywhere. Power lines draped across the road. Debris, metal siding, insulation. Pieces of homes he didn't recognize covered the ground like confetti. He ran through it all, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, searching for landmarks. When he reached where his parents' home should have been, there was nothing. Not wreckage, not a collapsed trailer. Nothing. The mobile home had been picked up and carried away, leaving only the concrete pad and a few pipes sticking out of the ground. "Dad!" Brian screamed into the darkness. "Mom!" The rain kept falling, the thunder rolled, and somewhere in the mud and debris field, under pieces of homes and trees and campers that had been thrown like toys, Keith and Kathy Selby lay dying. It would take Brian 9 hours to find his father's body.
Just piles of debris everywhere and chaos. EMS and emergency personnel couldn't get to us, so it was really just neighbors depending on each other.
In a time of crisis, Lauren and her family chose to pick up the pieces, find lost household items, and rebuild their home during the pandemic.
Just this town, it really kept us here, and I'm so glad we...
The day began unremarkably. On the morning of March 2nd, 2020, the meteorologists at the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, were tracking a familiar pattern, a progressive shortwave trough moving across the central United States, a surface low-pressure system developing over Arkansas, a plume of warm, moist air advancing northward from the Gulf of Mexico. It was the kind of setup that happens dozens of times each spring. Sometimes it produces severe weather. Sometimes it fizzles. The atmosphere, as any forecaster will tell you, is fickle. The first risk outlook, issued at 1:05 a.m., classified the threat as slight risk, the second lowest category on the SPC's 5-tier scale. The discussion mentioned an unstable atmosphere, but noted a critical limiting factor, a capping inversion, a layer of warm air aloft that was suppressing storm development. Translation: the atmosphere was loaded with potential energy, but it was locked behind a door that might never open.
We were left with nothing and lived day by day, relied on our friends and family in the community to bring us what we needed, and God provided all that to us, and that in itself is a miracle.
In Cookeville, in Nashville, across the rolling hills and valleys of the Upper Cumberland, people woke to a mild, cloudy morning. Temperatures were in the mid-60s. The air was humid, dew points in the low 60s, but it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like spring. Nobody was worried about tornadoes. Why would they be? Tornado season in Tennessee is typically April and May, when the clash between warm Gulf moisture and cold Canadian air reaches its peak. March tornadoes happen, certainly, but violent ones? EF4 intensity events that strike in the dead of night and kill 19 people? That wasn't supposed to happen here.
25 people died, 19 of those in Putnam County, 15 alone in Cookeville, that town devastated by an EF4 tornado.
By mid-afternoon, the forecast was evolving. The capping inversion that lid on the atmospheric pressure cooker was showing signs of weakening. Computer models suggested that by evening, storms would begin to fire along a cold front advancing through West Tennessee. If those storms remained discreet, if they didn't congeal into a messy line of squalls, they could become supercells. Supercells are the engines of violent tornadoes. They're thunderstorms with a rotating updraft, a mesocyclone that can persist for hours, traveling hundreds of miles, spawning tornado after tornado along their track. They're relatively rare in Tennessee. When they do occur, they're deadly. The SPC upgraded portions of West Tennessee to enhanced risk at 3 p.m., but Middle Tennessee, the I-40 corridor where Nashville and Cookeville sat, remained under slight risk. The assumption was that storms would weaken as they moved east, that the instability would decrease, that the threat would diminish with distance from the Mississippi River. The assumption was wrong.
That's right. I wanted to take you around just to look at this neighborhood. This is West Broad, one of the hardest hit areas by the tornado. We still have some properties that are completely open spaces that used to be These are homes that used to be standing here, and there's some work that you can see at different spots. Like there was this gas station that was completely destroyed last year that, as you can see, is now rebuilding.
As the sun set over Nashville, the city was preparing for something entirely unrelated to weather: Super Tuesday voting. March 3rd, 2020, was one of the most consequential days of the presidential primary season. Polling places across Tennessee were ready to open at 7 a.m. Volunteers were prepping voter rolls. Campaign workers were making final calls. The media was gearing up for what was expected to be a marathon night of election coverage. Nobody was talking about tornadoes. On local television, the evening news mentioned severe weather as an afterthought. Storms possible overnight. Stay tuned for updates before returning to primary coverage. On social media, Nashvillians were more concerned about The Bachelor being preempted than they were about the weather maps showing a line of storms approaching from the west. The tornado warnings would start in less than 6 hours. The cap broke at 9:15 p.m. On radar, it looked like an explosion. Within minutes, thunderstorms erupted along the cold front, towering cumulus clouds punching through the capping inversion and surging upward into the stratosphere. By 9:30 p.m., the storms had organized into discrete cells, each one feeding on the rich moisture and strong wind shear now dominating the environment. One cell, in particular, stood out. It had formed near the Mississippi River, just inside the Tennessee border, and was moving east-northeast at 40 miles per hour. Its structure was textbook: a classic supercell with a well-defined hook echo on radar, a clear indication of rotation. The low-level jet, a river of fast-moving air just a few thousand feet above the ground, was accelerating, pumping incredible amounts of wind shear into the storm's base. The storm relative helicity values were off the charts, over 350 meters squared per second in the 0 to 1 kilometer layer. That's the altitude range where tornadoes form. High helicity means high spin. High spin means tornadoes. The National Weather Service office in Nashville issued a tornado watch at 11:03 p.m. The watch covered all of Middle Tennessee and was valid until 6 a.m. the following morning. The message was clear: conditions are favorable for tornadoes, some of which may be strong to violent. The first tornado touched down at 12:28 a.m., 7 miles northeast of Pegram, in far western Davidson County. It was relatively weak at first, EF0 strength, snapping tree branches and downing power lines as it crossed the Cumberland River and moved through the rural community of Bells Bend. But supercells don't produce static tornadoes. They produce evolving ones, dynamic vortexes that intensify and weaken based on the storm's internal processes. By 12:30 a.m., the tornado had strengthened to EF2 intensity and was bearing down on John C. Toon Airport. The airport was home to charter jets, small aircraft, news helicopters, and 17 metal hangars. None of them were designed to withstand 120-mile-per-hour winds. The tornado shredded the facility. Hangars peeled open like tin cans. Aircraft flipped and crumpled. The terminal building lost its roof. The headquarters of Western Express Incorporated, a trucking company adjacent to the airport, was leveled. No one was killed. The airport was closed at that hour, and the industrial area was nearly empty. But the destruction was total, and it was just the beginning. The tornado crossed the Cumberland River for the third time and entered one of Nashville's most historic neighborhoods, Germantown. Built in the 1800s, Germantown was a district of Victorian homes, brick warehouses converted into lofts, trendy restaurants, and locally owned shops. It was also home to thousands of residents who, at 12:38 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, were asleep. The tornado was now EF3 intensity. Wind speeds exceeded 150 miles per hour. Apartment buildings collapsed. Homes lost roofs and exterior walls. The steeple of Hopewell Missionary Baptist Church, a structure built in 1880, crumbled. The Kroger grocery store on Fifth Avenue was gutted. Power lines snapped, plunging entire city blocks into darkness. Natural gas lines ruptured, filling the air with the smell of propane and forcing temporary evacuations. 2 people died in Germantown, crushed by falling debris. Another 200 were injured. The tornado continued east, unstoppable, insatiable. The Five Points neighborhood in East Nashville is known for its music venues. dive bars, and late-night culture. On this particular Monday night, now technically Tuesday morning, dozens of people were still out, finishing their drinks, wrapping up conversations, heading to their cars. When the tornado sirens started wailing, most of them didn't react immediately. Tornado warnings in Nashville were common. The storms usually stayed south of the city, or they weakened before arrival, or the warnings expired without incident. This was different. Michael Dolfini, 36 years old, worked as a bartender at Attaboy Lounge. His girlfriend, Albry Sexton, 33, had stopped by to meet him after his shift. At 12:45 a.m., as the tornado bore down on 5 Points, they made a decision that would cost them their lives. They stepped outside. The debris cloud hit them before they had time to run. Michael and Albry were struck by flying material pieces of buildings, fragments of trees, objects moving at over 100 miles per hour. They died together on the sidewalk, just steps from the door they'd walked through moments earlier. Inside the venues, chaos erupted. The basement east, a beloved music hall, lost its entire facade. The roof collapsed. Equipment, instruments, memorabilia, everything was destroyed. Burger Up, Boombah's Craft Pizza, clean juice businesses that had been thriving hours earlier were now unrecognizable heaps of rubble. But amid the destruction, one thing remained standing. The I Believe in Nashville mural, painted on the side of a building that had been partially demolished. The words stood intact against the wreckage, a defiant message of resilience. The tornado weakened briefly as it moved northeast, dropping to EF1 intensity as it crossed residential areas south of the interstate. But supercells don't relinquish their energy easily. As the storm moved into Donaldson, a suburb east of Nashville, it re-intensified. Stanford Estates, a subdivision of well-built homes, took a direct hit. The tornado, now back to EF3 strength, tore through the neighborhood, with winds approaching 160 miles per hour. Homes were leveled, roofs were thrown hundreds of yards. Entire families found themselves suddenly exposed to the elements, their walls gone, their possessions scattered across the county. Donaldson Christian Academy, a private school serving hundreds of students, was obliterated. The main building, constructed of concrete masonry unit walls and steel roof trusses, collapsed entirely. Classrooms where children had been learning just hours earlier were reduced to piles of concrete and twisted metal. The school would never reopen in that location. The tornado continued east into Wilson County, re-strengthening to EF3 intensity as it approached Mount Juliet. It was now 60 miles from where it had first touched down. It had been on the ground for over 40 minutes, and it showed no signs of stopping. In Mount Juliet, the tornado claimed 3 more lives. Donna and James Eaton, 81 and 84 years old, had been married for over 50 years. They died together in their sleep, their home collapsing around them. Brandy Barker, a 38-year-old mother of 2, was working security at the CEVA warehouse on Athletes Way North when the tornado struck. She was crushed by falling debris. The tornado tore apart an industrial park, destroyed dozens of homes, and carved a 6-mile path through Wilson County before finally crossing into Smith County near Lebanon. There, at last, around 1:28 a.m., it dissipated. 60.1 to 3 miles, 56 minutes on the ground, 5 dead, 220 injured. The longest track tornado in Middle Tennessee history. But the supercell wasn't finished. As the Nashville tornado lifted near Gordonsville, meteorologists at the National Weather Service were watching the storm with increasing alarm. The supercell was still rotating, the mesocyclone was still strong, and radar indicated that the storm was beginning to cycle to produce a new tornado from the same parent circulation. For 15 minutes, the storm produced only weak, sporadic damage. EF0 intensity wind gusts snapped tree branches and damaged outbuildings. But there was no tornado on the ground. To anyone checking radar, it appeared the threat was diminishing. This was the deceptive calm. Inside the supercell, the rear flank downdraft was wrapping around the old circulation, cutting it off from its inflow of warm, unstable air. The old mesocyclone was dying, but a new one was forming, tightening, organizing itself. And this time, as the storm crossed into Putnam County, the environment was primed for rapid intensification. The wind shear was extreme. The helicity values were maxed out. The low-level jet was screaming. and the topography of Putnam County rolling hills and valleys that could channel wind, creating localized areas of enhanced rotation, was about to interact with the storm in the worst possible way. The second tornado, the one that would earn the title Impossible, was about to begin. Circulation tightened rapidly as it crossed from Smith County into Putnam County. Within 60 seconds, it had drilled a vortex to the ground 2.5 miles northwest of Baxter, near Highway 70. The touchdown was almost simultaneous with the warning. At 1:48 a.m., the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Putnam County. At 1:48 a.m., the tornado touched down. Lead time, 0. For the residents of western Putnam County, sleeping in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, the warning and the danger arrived together. Their phones shrieked, the sirens wailed, and outside, in the darkness, the wind began to scream. What happened next defied the typical tornado life cycle. Most tornadoes that touch down at EF0 intensity take time to strengthen minutes, sometimes longer. They grow gradually, the vortex widening, the winds accelerating as the storm's inflow increases. But the Cookeville tornado was different. It was a product of a cycling supercell, and it had inherited all the rotational energy of the storm that had spawned the Nashville tornado. It strengthened with terrifying speed. 1:49 a.m. The tornado crossed Gainsborough Highway and struck the Prosperity Point subdivision. Damage jumped to EF2 intensity. Roofs were torn from homes. Exterior walls began to fail. The path width expanded from 50 yards to 200. 1:50 a.m. The tornado moved into the Double Springs community, intercepting Bloomington Road and Clemens Road. Intensity climbed to EF3. Well-built homes were severely damaged. Trees were debarked and snapped. The sound changed no longer just wind, but a grinding, roaring cacophony that could be heard for miles. 1:51 a.m. The tornado reached peak intensity, high-end EF4, 175 miles per hour. The path width ballooned to 900 yards over half a mile wide. The impossible tornado had arrived. Hensley Drive was a cul-de-sac of 17 homes, each one a mirror of the American dream. 2-story brick construction, well-maintained lawns, attached garages, young families inside. At 1:52 a.m., that dream ended. The tornado struck with peak intensity. The wind speed at the center of the vortex exceeded 175 miles per hour, possibly higher, though the destruction was so complete that precise measurement became impossible. The pressure drop at the tornado's core was so extreme that buildings didn't just collapse, they exploded outward, their walls rupturing like overfilled balloons. 17 homes. Gone. Not damaged. Not partially destroyed. Gone. Swept clean from their foundations in some cases, leaving only bare concrete slabs and the occasional pipe sticking out of the ground. The debris was granulated, shredded into pieces so small they looked like confetti. Brick became dust. Wood became splinters. Glass became powder. The tornado didn't destroy these homes, it erased them. Josh, Aaron, and 2-year-old Sawyer Kimberlin never had a chance. Their home was located at the center of the path, directly beneath the most violent portion of the vortex. When the tornado struck, the structure disintegrated in seconds. The walls separated from the foundation. The roof launched into the air. Everything inside, furniture, belongings, the family themselves, was pulled into the maelstrom. They were found together afterward, in the debris field 100 yards from where their home had stood. That small mercy that they were together in the end was the only comfort their grieving family could find. Josh and Aaron were known in the community for their faith, their warmth, their willingness to help anyone who needed it. Sawyer, with his bright smile and endless energy, had been the light of their lives. At their funeral, hundreds gathered to mourn a family that had embodied everything good about Cookeville. Their loss became a symbol of the tragedy. 3 lives, a young family with everything ahead of them, taken in an instant by a force no human could withstand. 2 doors down from the Kimberlins lived Jessica Clark, 31 years old, an accountant tech for the city of Cookeville. Jessica was known for her kindness. Co-workers described her as someone who remembered birthdays, who always had time to listen, who made the office a better place simply by being there. Friends said she was the person you called when you needed advice, when you needed a laugh, when you needed someone to tell you everything would be okay. On the night of March 3rd, everything was not okay. Jessica's home was destroyed with the same violence that claimed the Kimberlins. She died in the wreckage, alone, before rescue workers could reach her. Her death left a hole in the lives of everyone who knew her, a reminder that tragedy doesn't discriminate, that violence doesn't care about goodness or kindness or how much you're loved. Amanda Ann Cole, 34, was babysitting that night. She was watching Dawson Curtis, a young boy whose father, Terry Curtis, 54, lived nearby. It was a typical arrangement, the kind of thing that happens in small communities, where everyone knows everyone, where neighbors help neighbors, where trust is a given. When the tornado struck, Amanda was with Dawson. Neither survived. Terry Curtis, racing to save his son, died in the same wreckage. 3 lives, linked by circumstance and care, ended together. Hattie Collins had an infectious smile, that's what everyone who knew her said afterward. At 4 years old, she was full of life, full of joy, the kind of child who brightened a room just by walking into it. When the tornado hit, Hattie was in the arms of family members. They tried to shield her, tried to protect her with their own bodies, but the force was too great. She died surrounded by people who loved her, people who would have done anything to save her. At the memorial service, 19 trees were planted at Hope Park, 1 for each victim. Hattie's tree stands near the center, a small oak that will grow and live and shade the ground where children will someday play, never knowing the story of the little girl who died there. Stephanie Field, 36, and her son, Harlan Marsh, 5, lived together on the path's edge. Their home took a direct hit. Mother and son, like so many others, were found together in the aftermath. The tornado had taken them both, but it hadn't separated them. That detail, small, terrible, somehow comforting, would be repeated at vigils and memorials in the days to come. Todd and Sue Kaler were pillars of the community. Sue was a manager at the Algood Walmart, known for her dedication to her employees and her customers. Todd was her constant companion, her partner, the person she'd built a life with. They died together in their home on Hensley Drive. Like the Eaton couple in Mount Juliet, they were married for decades, their lives intertwined, their deaths simultaneous. There's no comfort in that, not really, but it's what survivors cling to in the aftermath. At least they weren't alone. Pat Lane, 67, was an active member of College's-Side Church of Christ and a beloved grandmother. Her home was among those completely destroyed on Hensley Drive. She was found in the debris, another victim of winds that no structure in the neighborhood could withstand. Leisha Rittenberry, 28, still had a lot of life left to live. That's what her family said when they identified her body. She was young, full of plans, full of dreams. The tornado took all of it. Bridget McCormick, 13, always had a smile on her face. She was a teenager, navigating that awkward phase between childhood and adulthood, figuring out who she was and who she wanted to be. She died on Hensley Drive, one of 5 children killed that night. Her death, like all the others, left a hole that would never be filled in her family, in her school, in her community. Keith and Kathy Selby lived in a mobile home in the Double Springs community, just off the main path, but close enough to be caught by the tornado's violent winds. Their home was picked up and thrown, disintegrating in the air. When it came down, it was scattered across half a mile. Keith and Kathy were inside. Their son, Brian, who survived nearby, spent 9 hours searching for them in the darkness, crawling through mud and debris, calling their names, praying for a miracle. He found his father's body under a camper that had been tossed like a toy. His mother's body was found later. The trauma of that search, the smell of pine and gasoline, the sound of rain and thunder, the beam of a flashlight cutting through a landscape of destruction would stay with Brian for the rest of his life. Jamie Smith, 36, had moved to Tennessee about 10 years before her death. She owned a cleaning business, worked hard, built a life in the Upper Cumberland. She died in her home when the tornado swept through. Another life cut short, another dream left unrealized. Robert Dixon survived the initial impact. He was pulled from the wreckage and transported to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, one of the best trauma hospitals in the region. But the injuries were too severe. He died there despite the best efforts of the medical team, bringing the final death toll to 19. 3/4 of a mile west of Hensley Drive, Charles Williams was still huddled in the bathroom with his family. The tornado was directly overhead. The house around them was disintegrating, not slowly, not piece by piece, but all at once, in a single catastrophic failure. The living room exploded outward. The kitchen roof launched into the air. The master bedroom ceased to exist. But the bathroom, reinforced by plumbing stacks and interior walls, held. Barely. The wind screamed. The pressure changed, ears popping, chest tightening. The sensation of being underwater. Debris hammered the walls. Something heavy, a tree, a piece of someone else's house, crashed into the exterior bathroom wall, buckling it inward. Charles pressed harder against his family, his body a shield, his voice a constant mantra. Stay down, stay down. It's almost over. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The wind cut off. The roar faded. Rain fell, gentle and absurd in its normalcy. Charles lifted his head, looked around, and realized that the bathroom walls, just 2 of them, barely standing, were the only parts of the house still intact. Everything else was gone. Tamara was crying, clutching their daughter. Their youngest child was shaking but alive. Charles stood on shaking legs, stepped out of what used to be a bathroom, and found himself standing on a slab of concrete surrounded by emptiness. The neighborhood he'd lived in for years was unrecognizable. Homes were gone. Trees were gone. The streetlights were out. The only sounds were car alarms and distant screams. "We're alive," Charles whispered. "We're alive." The tornado continued east, still at peak intensity. It struck the Echo Valley Drive area, an apartment complex, and several single-family homes with the same violence it had shown on Hensley Drive. The apartment building was a 2-story structure with 24 units. When the tornado hit, the building simply folded. The second story collapsed onto the first. Interior walls became projectiles. Furniture, belongings, people, all were thrown into the chaos. 5 more homes were completely leveled in the Echo Valley area. The debris was swept clean from some foundations, suggesting wind speeds at the very high end of EF4, possibly breaching EF5 threshold. But without surviving structures to measure, without clear damage indicators, the National Weather Service couldn't confirm the higher rating. The path width at this point was 900 yards over half a mile. The tornado was so large that people on one side of the path had no idea what was happening on the other side. It was a wall of violence, advancing through the darkness, invisible until it was too late. In the commercial areas near Echo Valley, investigators would later find something that sparked intense debate among wind engineers. Concrete parking stops, those heavy barriers at the end of parking spaces, had been displaced, not just moved, but thrown. Some were found 50 feet from their original positions. Others had been shattered, broken into pieces by the force of impact. To move a solid concrete block weighing 200 to 300 pounds requires immense force. The coefficient of friction between concrete and asphalt is high. The blocks are low profile, offering little surface area for wind to push against. Yet here they were, scattered like toys. Calculations suggested that wind speeds of over 200 miles per hour, EF5 intensity, would be required to achieve this kind of displacement. But the National Weather Service, bound by strict protocols, couldn't confirm those speeds. The pre-storm condition of the parking blocks was unknown. Were they properly anchored? Were they cracked? Were they sitting on gravel instead of asphalt? Without answers, the rating stayed at EF4. But the debate over the Cookeville tornado's true intensity would continue for years, fueling documentaries, research papers, and endless online discussions among storm chasers and meteorology enthusiasts. The Cookeville tornado truly impossible wasn't just its intensity, it was the gradient of destruction. On Hensley Drive, investigators documented homes that were completely obliterated, sitting mere yards from homes that sustained only EF0, damage minor, siding loss, broken windows, shingle damage. The transition wasn't gradual. It was sharp, immediate, inexplicable. This tight damage gradient suggested a tornado that was incredibly compact at its core, with a rapid pressure drop concentrated in a narrow drill bit of violent wind. The outer circulation, that 900-yard wide path, was relatively weak, producing EF1 or EF2 damage. But at the center, the winds were catastrophic. This explained why some neighbors survived unscathed while others were obliterated. It explained the randomness, the perceived unfairness of the storm's selection. The tornado wasn't choosing victims. It was wandering within its broader circulation, its violent core touching down seemingly at random, destroying one house and sparing the next, based purely on chance. That randomness would fuel survivors' guilt for years to come. Amy Jennings finally convinced her husband to wake up. They realized their home had been spared. Damaged. Yes, windows broken. Siding torn off. Debris covering the lawn but structurally intact. The bedroom they were standing in had walls and a roof. The lights, powered by a backup generator that had kicked in automatically, still worked. And then they heard the screaming. It was coming from outside, from the darkness, from the neighborhood that no longer existed. People were stumbling through the wreckage, covered in mud and blood, calling for help. Children were crying. Someone was yelling about a gas leak. Darrell grabbed his flashlight. Amy opened the front door. And for the next 6 hours, their home became a triage center, a beacon of light in a landscape of darkness. "It's like we were a beacon," Amy would say later. The only light left on the street. People came from everywhere. A mother carrying a baby with a cut on its forehead. A man with a broken arm who refused to go to the hospital until he found his wife. A teenage girl in pajamas, shaking with shock, unable to speak. An elderly couple who'd been blown out of their bedroom and landed in their front yard. The Jennings family, Amy, Darrell, and their teenage children, did what they could. They bandaged wounds with first aid supplies and torn t-shirts. They wrapped people in blankets. They made coffee and offered water. They held crying babies and called 911 over and over, reporting injuries, describing locations, begging for ambulances. First responders couldn't get through. The roads were blocked. Trees, power lines, entire houses sitting in the middle of the street. The Jennings home became an impromptu shelter, a gathering point for survivors, a place where people could sit down and cry and realize they were still alive. "We didn't do anything special," Darrell would say later. We had light, we had walls, so we opened the door." The tornado dissipated as abruptly as it had intensified. At 1:56 a.m., just west of downtown Cookeville, the vortex lifted. The winds decreased. The rotation collapsed. The rear flank downdraft, which had been fueling the tornado's violence, finally wrapped completely around the circulation and choked it off. The storm moved on, continuing east, still producing rain and lightning, but no longer a tornado. Behind it, an 8.23-mile scar stretched across Putnam County, a path of destruction that would take years to heal and decades to forget. Total time on the ground, 8 minutes. Total deaths, 19. Total homes destroyed, 170. 1:57 a.m., 1 minute after the tornado had lifted, the National Weather Service issued a tornado emergency for Putnam County. A tornado emergency is the highest level of warning, reserved for situations where a violent tornado is confirmed on the ground and headed for a populated area. It's the announcement that says, "This is not a drill. Take shelter now. Your life is in danger." But by the time the warning was issued, the danger had passed. The tornado was gone. The people of Hensley Drive, Double Springs, and Echo Valley were already dead or injured or huddling in the wreckage of their homes, trying to process what had just happened. The warning system had failed not because of negligence or incompetence, but because the tornado had evolved faster than radar could track, faster than warnings could be disseminated, faster than human reaction time could accommodate. It was an operational meteorology nightmare. A violent tornado with zero lead time, striking a populated area in the dead of night with no visual confirmation possible until it was too late. The lessons learned from this failure would reshape warning protocols across the Southeast, but those lessons came at a terrible cost. When the sun rose over Cookeville on the morning of March 3, 2020, it revealed a landscape that looked like a war zone. The damaged path was immediately visible from the air, a brown scar cutting through the green hills of Putnam County, as if someone had taken a giant eraser to the landscape, Trees were stripped of bark, snapped at the base, laid down in parallel rows that pointed back toward the tornado's origin. Homes were missing, businesses were gone, roads were buried under debris. The scale of the destruction was difficult to comprehend. This wasn't a few damaged buildings. This wasn't scattered wreckage. This was wholesale erasure of entire neighborhoods, acre after acre of devastation that stretched for miles. First responders who arrived at dawn faced an overwhelming task. Roads were impassable. Power lines draped across streets, some still live, sparking and dangerous. Natural gas lines were ruptured, filling the air with the smell of propane. Water mains had broken, turning low areas into mud pits. And everywhere there was debris. Not wreckage, debris. The distinction is important. Wreckage implies recognizable pieces of buildings, things you can identify, furniture and walls and roofs. Debris is granulated, shredded, mixed together, until it's impossible to tell what came from where. A piece of siding from one house is wrapped around a tree from another yard. A child's toy sits in the rubble of a house 3 streets away. A family photo, miraculously intact, lies in a puddle. Search and rescue teams from across Tennessee converged on Cookeville. Urban search and rescue units, fire departments, police, EMS, the National Guard. They brought dogs trained to detect human scent, heavy equipment to move debris, and the grim determination to find survivors. But as the hours passed, hope faded. The injuries they were finding were devastating blunt force trauma, crush injuries, lacerations from flying glass and metal. Many victims hadn't survived the initial impact. Others died before help could arrive. But didn't wait for first responders. As dawn broke, he was still searching, still calling for his parents, still digging through the debris field where their mobile home had been. He was covered in mud, cut from crawling over metal and wood, exhausted from hours of frantic effort. But he couldn't stop. At 9:30 a.m., he found his father. Keith Selby's body was trapped under a camper that had been thrown by the tornado and come down on top of the debris pile. Brian called for help. A search and rescue team arrived with equipment, carefully lifting the camper, extracting Keith's body with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. Kathy Selby's body was found later that day. Mother and father, husband and wife, gone in the same instant. Their mobile home, no match for 170-mile-per-hour winds. Brian would later describe that 9-hour search as the defining trauma of his life. Worse than the tornado itself, worse than the loss. The act of searching, of holding on to hope, even as reality made hope impossible. While official search and rescue operations were underway, the community of Cookeville was organizing its own response. Within hours of dawn, hundreds of volunteers descended on the damaged areas. They brought chainsaws to cut through fallen trees. They brought trucks to haul debris. They brought food and water for survivors and first responders. They brought generators, tarps, blankets, diapers, medicine, anything they thought might help. Churches opened their doors as shelters. The local high school became a distribution center. Restaurants that still had power-cooked meals for anyone who needed them. The response wasn't coordinated by any central authority. It was organic, instinctive, the natural reaction of a community that had just watched its neighbors suffer. Everyone knew someone who was affected, one volunteer said later. It was personal for all of us. The story of the Cookeville tornado made national news by mid-morning. Cable networks interrupted their Super Tuesday election coverage to show aerial footage of the destruction. The death toll climbed throughout the day. 9 dead, then 14, then 18, finally settling at 19 once Robert Dixon died at Vanderbilt. Support poured in from across the country. Taylor Swift, a Nashville resident and one of the biggest music stars in the world, donated $1 million to relief efforts. The Tennessee Titans NFL team donated another $1 million. Multiple country music stars held a benefit concert to raise money for victims. Donations flooded in through social media, so many that Venmo temporarily couldn't handle the volume. The Cookeville Relief Fund would eventually raise $2.3 million. It was an outpouring of generosity that reflected the scale of the tragedy and the national attention it received. March 6th, 3 days after the tornado, President Donald Trump visited Cookeville to survey the damage. He toured the destroyed neighborhoods, walking past concrete slabs where homes had stood, talking to survivors and first responders. His message was simple. We love them. They're special people. The visit was brief, a few hours, a few photo opportunities, a commitment to federal disaster assistance. But for many survivors, the president's presence was meaningful, a recognition that their tragedy mattered, that the nation was watching, that help was coming. 2 weeks after the tornado, the world changed. On March 15th, the COVID-19 pandemic reached Tennessee. Within days, the state was in lockdown, businesses closed, schools shut down, social distancing became mandatory. The volunteer efforts that had been so crucial to Cookeville's recovery ground to a halt. People who had lost their homes found themselves unable to rebuild because contractors weren't allowed to work. Insurance adjusters couldn't visit damaged properties. Supply chains broke down, making materials unavailable. The entire recovery process, already overwhelming, became exponentially more complicated. It felt like we got hit twice, one survivor said. First the tornado, then the pandemic. It was like the world was saying, "You think that was bad? Here's more." Ryan Myers was one of many who refused to let the tornado define his future. His home had been destroyed, not damaged, destroyed, gone, but he owned the land, and he was determined to rebuild on it. So, while contractors were shut down by the pandemic, while insurance claims were being processed, while the world seemed to be falling apart, Ryan moved into a camper on his property and started rebuilding himself. With the help of his sons and volunteers who could spare the time, he worked 7 days a week, framing walls, pouring concrete, running electrical wire. It was slow, exhausting work. The hardest part is just staying mentally strong, he said. Physically working all week and then coming here and working on this, it drains me. But by late 2020, his new home was standing. It wasn't finished, the interior was bare, the landscaping non-existent, but it had walls and a roof, and it was his. Charles Williams took a different approach. When he rebuilt his home on Plunk-Whitson Road, he didn't try to recreate what had been lost. He built a fortress. The new structure featured 12-inch thick solid concrete walls, not wood framing with brick veneer, but actual poured concrete, reinforced with steel rebar. The master closet was converted into a dedicated safe room with additional reinforcement. There was nothing left last time, Charles said. I know for a fact that closet's still going to be here. The cost was significantly higher than standard construction. The timeline was longer. But for Charles, who had huddled in a bathroom while his house disintegrated around him, who had watched his neighbors die, who carried the weight of survival guilt, the expense was worth it. He couldn't prevent another tornado, but he could build something that would withstand one. 1 year after the tornado, Gary Bean was interviewed by local news. When asked how he was doing, his answer was painfully honest. Every time it storms or when storm warnings are out, I don't sleep well at night. Weather anxiety became endemic in Cookeville after the tornado. Survivors described panic attacks triggered by dark clouds, by the sound of thunder, by tornado watches that used to be routine and now felt like death sentences. The casual attitude toward severe weather, common in areas where tornadoes are frequent but rarely violent, vanished overnight. Mental health professionals reported a surge in PTSD diagnoses. Therapists who specialized in disaster trauma found themselves overwhelmed with clients. Schools brought in counselors to help students process the loss of classmates, the destruction of familiar places, the fundamental disruption of their sense of safety. People don't understand that the physical recovery is only half the battle, one therapist said. The psychological recovery takes years. Some people never fully recover. Deanna Sliger-Osland's experience illustrated the strange randomness of survival. Her home was at the edge of the damage path. The tornado passed along her fence line, close enough that she could see it through her window, close enough that the wind shattered her windows and tore off her roof. But her house remained standing. Her neighbors weren't so lucky. The houses on the other side of her fence, houses where she knew the families, where she'd attended barbecues and birthday parties, were gone, completely erased. And in the aftermath, her home became an island of relative normalcy, surrounded by devastation. The tornado line goes right along my fence line and just wiped out all of those houses. Osland said a year later, We had to get all new vinyl windows, a roof, shutters, gutters, fence, our sheds. But the physical damage was fixable. The psychological impact was not. Deanna still woke up at night, panicked, convinced she heard the tornado coming back. Her dog, who had woken her that night by barking frantically, developed anxiety issues. The sound of wind, any wind, even a gentle breeze, made her heart race. Living at the edge meant living with constant reminders. Empty lots where houses used to be, roads that led to nowhere, families that had moved away, unable to stay in a place that held so much trauma. Amid all the loss and trauma, small symbols of hope emerged. Aubrey Owen's story became one of them. Aubrey was a junior at Upperman High School. Her family's home had been destroyed, not damaged, destroyed in the tornado. In the days after, as they sifted through the debris field looking for anything salvageable, Aubrey spotted something blue in the field behind where the house had been. It was her prom dress. Somehow, miraculously, the tornado had picked up the dress, carried it hundreds of yards, and deposited it in a field, dirty but intact, with the tags still attached. The image of Aubrey holding the dress, a beautiful blue gown against a background of total destruction, went viral. It became a symbol of resilience, of reclaiming normalcy from chaos, of a teenager refusing to let disaster steal her adolescence. The photo appeared in news articles, on social media, in documentaries about the tornado. Aubrey wore the dress to prom that year, because tornadoes don't get to win. The land where the Kimberlin home had stood, along with many of the other homes on Hensley Drive, was not redeveloped into new housing. Instead, the community, led by the nonprofit 10 Green, decided to convert it into a memorial park. Hope Park opened in 2021. It features a playground for children, walking trails, and 19 trees, one for each victim. At the center stands a memorial sculpture, a permanent tribute that lists the names of those who died. The decision to create a park rather than rebuild houses was deliberate. "This is hallowed ground," one community member said at the dedication. "These are places where families died. We can't just put new homes here and pretend it didn't happen." The park serves multiple purposes. It's a memorial, yes, but also a space for healing, for community gatherings, for children to play in a place that once knew only tragedy. It's a way of reclaiming the land, not for profit or development, but for memory and hope. Every March 3rd, survivors and family members gather at Hope Park for a remembrance ceremony. They light candles, they share stories, they cry together, and support each other. The tornado took their loved ones, but it didn't take their community. In the months following the tornado, the National Weather Service conducted an extensive service assessment, examining what went right and what went wrong in the warning process. The findings were sobering. The lead time issue was unavoidable. The tornado touched down as the warning was issued. The storm cycled rapidly, giving meteorologists no time to issue an earlier alert. But the assessment identified other problems. Nocturnal timing meant traditional dissemination methods, TV, radio, sirens, were less effective. People were asleep. Even those who heard the warnings often didn't understand the urgency. Wireless emergency alerts didn't reach everyone. Some phones were on Do Not Disturb mode. Some alerts didn't go through because of cell tower damage from the Nashville tornado. Some people received the alerts but didn't know what to do with them. The slight risk designation earlier in the day may have lulled people into complacency. To meteorologists, slight risk means scattered, severe storms with possible tornadoes. To the public, it sounds like not a big deal. The service assessment made recommendations: better nocturnal warning systems, clearer communication of risk levels, improved public education about tornado safety. But everyone involved acknowledged the brutal truth. Some tornadoes simply can't be warned with adequate lead time. The Cookeville tornado became a case study for a growing phenomenon in severe weather research, the Dixie Alley problem. Dixie Alley refers to the region of the southeast Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, where tornadoes are increasingly frequent and deadly. Unlike the Great Plains Tornado Alley, where storms occur in open terrain during daylight hours, Dixie Alley tornadoes have three deadly characteristics. They occur at night, when visibility is zero and people are asleep. They form in environments with high wind shear but only moderate instability HSLC setups that are difficult to forecast. They occur in heavily forested, hilly terrain that obscures visual confirmation and makes shelter difficult. The Cookeville tornado exemplified all three factors. It struck at 2 a.m. It formed from a shear dominant environment with modest cape values. It tore through the rolling hills of the Upper Cumberland, where dense forest made it impossible for anyone to see the funnel until it was too late. Meteorologists now point to Cookeville as the definitive example of why tornado mortality in the southeast is increasing even as warning systems improve. The problem isn't lack of technology. The problem is the fundamental mismatch between nocturnal, high-shear tornadoes and the human ability to respond to warnings while asleep. In the wake of the tornado, Putnam County and the state of Tennessee began reevaluating building codes. The destruction on Hensley Drive raised difficult questions. The homes were well built by Tennessee standards. They had proper roof attachments, hurricane clips, and foundation bolts. They weren't poorly constructed, but they couldn't withstand 170-mile-per-hour winds. Nothing short of a reinforced concrete structure can withstand EF4 winds. Wood frame houses, no matter how well built, will fail. The question became, should building codes require safe rooms or storm shelters in new construction? The debate was complex. Safe rooms are expensive, adding thousands of dollars to construction costs. In a region where tornadoes are relatively rare, is it reasonable to require them? Would that make housing unaffordable for many families? Ultimately, Tennessee adopted a middle ground. New schools and public buildings in high-risk areas now require storm shelters. For residential construction, safe rooms are encouraged but not mandatory. Builders who include them receive incentives. Insurance companies offer discounts for homes with certified safe rooms. But for many survivors, the changes came too late. If we'd had a safe room, one widow said, my husband would still be alive. By March 3, 2025, the physical scars of the Cookeville tornado had largely healed. The debris was gone. Roads were repaired. Power lines were back up. New homes stood on many of the empty lots, though some remained vacant, either converted into Hope Park or left undeveloped by owners who couldn't bring themselves to rebuild. But the psychological scars remained. Walk through the neighborhoods that were hit, and you'll see subtle signs of the trauma. Storm shelters in almost every yard. Concrete bunkers that weren't there before. Foundations reinforced with extra bolts. Roofs with hurricane straps. Trees that are all the same age, planted to replace the mature oaks and maples that were snapped by the tornado. The people are different too. There's a wariness in their eyes when clouds gather, a tension when the weather forecast mentions severe storms. The casual attitude toward tornadoes, the "it won't happen to me" mentality that prevails in much of Tornado Alley is gone. Cookeville knows it can happen. Cookeville knows it did happen. On the 5th anniversary of the tornado, hundreds gathered at Hope Park for the remembrance ceremony. Survivors shared their stories. Family members of victims spoke about their loved ones, not just how they died, but how they lived, what they loved, what made them laugh. Children who were toddlers when the tornado hit, who have no memory of the event, heard for the first time about the night that changed their community forever. A bell rang 19 times, once for each victim. After each toll, a name was read. Josh Kimberlin, Aaron Kimberlin, Sawyer Kimberlin, Jessica Clark, Amanda Cole, Dawson Curtis, Terry Curtis, Hattie Collins, Stephanie Field, Harlan Marsh, Todd Kohler, Sue Kohler, Pat Lane, Leisha Rittenberry, Bridget McCormick, Keith Selby, Kathy Selby, Jamie Smith, Robert Dixon. The wind blew gently through the 19 memorial trees. Children played on the playground. Life continued, because that's what life does. But the memory remained, carved into the landscape, written into the community's DNA. Darrell Jennings, the man who witnessed his neighbor's house lift off its foundation, who turned his home into a beacon for survivors, was interviewed on the 5th anniversary. When it hit, people didn't take warnings as seriously as they do now, he said. I was watching. I saw one of the houses on Plunk Whitson just go up in the air, saw another roof come off, and about that same moment, the wind gust hit the back door and bent the back door in. His survival, he believes, came down to location and luck. Right place at the wrong time is what I say, you know. And you know, the one phrase I come out of it with is, "but for God." That phrase, "but for God," appears often in interviews with survivors. It's an acknowledgement that survival wasn't about preparation or skill or intelligence. It was about being 3 feet to the left instead of the right, about the tornado's violent core missing your house by 50 yards, about physics and probability and the fundamental randomness of natural disasters. Survivors feel guilt about that. They wonder why they lived when their neighbors died. They question whether they deserve their survival. Therapists call it survivor's guilt, and it's endemic in post-disaster communities. But Daryl has found a way to live with it. He focuses on what he can control, being prepared for the next storm, helping his neighbors, volunteering at Hope Park, telling his story so that others might learn from it. The Cookeville tornado earned its nickname the Impossible for multiple reasons. It was impossible to forecast. The storm appeared to be dying when it was actually cycling. The rapid intensification caught even experienced meteorologists off guard. It was impossible to warn. The tornado touched down as the warning was issued. There was no lead time, no window for people to seek shelter. It was impossible to survive for those directly in the path. 170-mile-per-hour winds don't leave room for error. No above-ground structure can withstand that force. The people who died didn't make mistakes. They simply couldn't get to adequate shelter in time. And it was impossible to explain the damage gradient. Why did this house vanish while the one next door survived? Why were 19 people killed when the tornado's path took it through a populated area for only 8 minutes? Why did probability and luck become life and death factors? The impossibility wasn't that the tornado occurred. Tornadoes happen in Tennessee. EF4 tornadoes happen, though rarely. The impossibility was the convergence of factors: the nocturnal timing, the rapid cycling, the compact violent core, the populated path, the zero lead time that made survival so arbitrary and death so random. The meteorological community took the Cookeville tornado as a mandate to improve nocturnal warning systems. Research into Warn-on forecast systems, which use high-resolution models to predict individual storm evolution, accelerated. The goal is to issue warnings before radar confirms a tornado, based on model projections of where and when a tornado will form. Studies into supercell cycling behavior increased. Understanding why and how storms produce new tornadoes after lifting the old one could provide crucial minutes of warning time. Public education campaigns focused on the Dixie Alley threat. Many people in Tennessee didn't realize they lived in a high-risk tornado zone. The Cookeville tornado changed that perception. But everyone involved acknowledges the fundamental limitation. You cannot prevent a 2 a.m. tornado from being deadly. You can improve warnings, you can educate the public, you can build better shelters, but when a violent tornado strikes in darkness, casualties are almost inevitable. The goal isn't to eliminate tornado deaths. The goal is to minimize them, to save as many lives as possible through better science, better communication, and better preparation. Numbers can obscure the reality of loss. 19 dead, 87 injured, 170 homes destroyed. These are statistics, data points in a database. But each number represents a life. Josh Kimberlin, who coached his son's t-ball team. Aaron Kimberlin, who volunteered at the church nursery. 2-year-old Sawyer, who loved dinosaurs. Jessica Clark, who always remembered birthdays. The Curtis family, linked by care and circumstance. 4-year-old Hattie Collins, with her infectious smile. Stephanie Field and her son Harlan. Todd and Sue Kohler, married for decades. Pat Lane, the beloved grandmother. Leisha Rittenberry, 28, with a lot of life left to live. 13-year-old Bridget McCormick, always smiling. Keith and Kathy Selby, found after 9 hours of searching. Jamie Smith, who'd built a business in her adopted home. Robert Dixon, who fought for days before succumbing to his injuries. These weren't abstract casualties. They were parents, children, friends, neighbors, co-workers, church members. They were people who contributed to their community, who were loved, who left holes that can never be filled. When we talk about tornado deaths, we're talking about these specific individuals. When we push for better warnings and stronger buildings, we're doing it for them to honor their memory by preventing others from suffering the same fate. 5 years later, Cookeville is not the same place it was on March 2nd, 2020. Physically, it's rebuilt. New homes stand where old ones fell. The debris is gone. The trees have been replanted. From a distance, you might not know anything had happened, but talk to anyone who lived through it, and you'll find a community forever changed. There's a shared trauma that binds people together, survivors, first responders, volunteers, neighbors who helped. There's a wariness about weather that wasn't there before. There's a commitment to preparedness, to having a plan, to not being caught off guard again. There's also a resilience, a stubborn refusal to be defined by disaster. The tornado was 8 minutes. Cookeville has centuries of history and, hopefully, centuries more ahead. The event doesn't define the place, but it's part of the story now, forever woven into the fabric of the community. The children being born today will grow up hearing about the impossible tornado. They'll visit Hope Park and ask about the 19 trees. They'll learn the names of the victims. They'll be taught that nature is powerful and survival is precious and community matters most of all. There's a question that lingers in discussions about the Cookeville tornado. Is this the future? Climate research suggests that the tornado season is shifting, starting earlier, ending later, and moving eastward from the Great Plains into the southeast. The Dixie Alley problem may be getting worse as atmospheric patterns change. This doesn't mean more tornadoes overall. The data on tornado frequency is complex and contradictory, but it may mean more tornadoes in populated areas, more nocturnal events, more situations like Cookeville where everything that can go wrong does go wrong. If that's the case, then the lessons from Cookeville become even more critical. We need better building codes in the southeast. We need widespread adoption of safe rooms and storm shelters. We need public education campaigns that treat tornado preparedness with the seriousness it deserves. We need communities to understand that they're not immune, that it can't happen here is a dangerous lie. Because it did happen in Cookeville, and if it happened there, it can happen anywhere. Rodney Kimberlin, father of Josh and grandfather of Sawyer, lost his son, daughter-in-law, and grandson in the tornado. In an interview 2 years after the event, he spoke about grief and faith and the fragility of life. "You preach about how life is a vapor, that it's just come and gone," he said. Rodney is a pastor, and for years he'd counseled others about the brevity of life, the importance of cherishing each moment, the theological understanding that death can come at any time. "You tell people all along how fragile and uncertain it is," he continued. "Now, I know it is. The difference between knowing intellectually and knowing experientially is the difference between understanding a concept and living with a loss." Rodney knows, in a way that no sermon or book can convey, that life is precious and fleeting and can be taken in an instant by forces beyond human control. But he also knows something else. That grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. That love persists beyond death. That community can help carry the weight of loss. That meaning can be found even in tragedy. "They're in a better place now," Rodney says, and whether you share his faith or not, the sentiment is clear. The people lost to the Cookeville tornado are not forgotten. They're remembered. They're honored. They're part of the continuing story of a community that refused to let disaster write its ending. The sun sets over Hope Park. The playground is empty now. It's late. The children have gone home. The 19 memorial trees cast long shadows across the grass. The memorial sculpture catches the last light of day, the names engraved on its surface still readable in the golden hour. A gentle breeze moves through the trees, rustling leaves that didn't exist 5 years ago. This land was once homes, families, lives being lived. Now it's sacred space, a place of remembering and healing. In the distance, over the hills to the west, clouds are building. It's spring in Tennessee, storm season. The atmosphere is unstable, the wind shear is present, and somewhere a meteorologist is watching a radar screen, hoping the storms stay scattered, hoping they don't organize, hoping tonight is not the night when probability aligns with tragedy. Because it can happen again. It will happen again. Somewhere, sometime. The question is not if, but when and where. The atmosphere doesn't care about our plans or hopes or fears. It follows physics, not compassion. But in Cookeville, people are ready. They have shelters. They have plans. They pay attention to warnings. They take nothing for granted. They remember March 3rd, 2020. They remember the 8 minutes. They remember the 19 names. And they live their lives with the knowledge that time is precious, that safety is not guaranteed, and that community is what gets us through when the impossible becomes real. The wind picks up slightly. The trees sway. The memorial stands. Life goes on. In memory of Josh Kimberlin, Aaron Kimberlin, Sawyer Kimberlin, Jessica Clark, Amanda Cole, Dawson Curtis, Terry Curtis, Hattie Collins, Stephanie Field, Harlan Marsh, Todd Kaler, Sue Kaler, Pat Lane, Leisha Rittenberry, Bridget McCormick, Keith Selby, Kathy Selby, Jamie Smith, and Robert Dixon. May their stories ensure that others are prepared, protected, and never forgotten.